What is a coincidence? I was watching Better Call Saul, and in it, Jimmy McGill, he's basically like his brother just died, so he's going through grief. But instead of actually expressing the grief and crying, he's basically appearing just fine. So he's taking on a repressing role, so to say, and he's distancing himself to the point where, very interestingly, during a scene, one because he used to be a lawyer and his brother used to have a law firm, and both of their last names are McGill. So the guy says, "Hey, can you be my lawyer?" And Jimmy's like, "No, I'm not a lawyer anymore, but I can refer you to a law firm. It's called Hamlin and McGill." And he says, "McGill, isn't that your last name?" And he says, "No, that's just a coincidence," which was for me like very brutal. There's been like two cold moments in the series that I've watched up to now, um, because I'm only in season four. But there was another moment when he and his brother were talking, and I think it's the moment where his brother, Chuck, excuse me, Chuck tells Jimmy that uh, he never needed him. He's basically like super angry at him, and he's telling him all this stuff, and I felt like that part was really cold too. But then when Jimmy says this, like, no, that's just a coincidence. I mean, he doesn't even mention like, oh yeah, that was my brother, but he passed away or something like that. No, he's just like, you could say you don't want to overcomplicate things, and you're just like, no, that's just a coincidence. Like it's just another guy whose last name is McGill, like mine, but it's just a coincidence. But what was interesting for me is like, what is a coincidence? And then because I made a video a while back on irony, which was like the fact that two things that are opposite coexist, but in a funny way or in a comical way. And I was also checking out reaction formation, which is a type of defense mechanism in psychoanalysis. I'm actually going to be talking about other defense mechanisms later on, but basically, what I noticed is that a coincidence is also two things that, in this case, appear to be related but are actually not, right? So we could talk about things that are happening on the exterior, on the surface, which is this relation between two things, and then things that are happening in reality or underneath it or in a more profound way, which is they're not related, right? Which would actually be the opposite to a certain extent of irony, which are two things that appear not to be related but are actually related, right? Kind of even like a paradox. What do I think about coincidence, irony, and reaction formation? Again, two apparently related things but are not related would be for an irony. I mean, for coincidence, and irony is comical. So this is like I thought about the two coke argument, which is like a person smoking telling others not to smoke, right? Or a person talking about corruption and how it's bad, and then you find out that they are corrupt, right? So it's comical, and it's like you're judging others for something that you yourself are doing. um it's linked to hypocrisy also in this case, but is the opposite of coincidence, like I mentioned, since two unrelated or even contradictory things are related, right? Reaction formation, I'm thinking, are actions that do not match internal feelings. And in a way, it's like being ironic, but it's also like to a certain extent like lying to yourself, right? Since it is a defense mechanism in psychoanalysis. And it is also not funny. Reaction formation is not funny, like treating someone you like hatefully. But there is a third element which is interesting in reaction formation, which is so, there's a reason why someone you like you hate because you can't be with them, for example. So that's the third element, because the transformation is caused by something like being very friendly to someone you resent because they did something to you, right? So it's like these two emotions or these two phenomena where you're you hate someone or you resent someone, so you do the opposite. Instead of being angry at them, you treat them overly friendly, you're super nice to them, but it's because of something they did to you, right? That's something they did to you would be the third element. So I asked ChatGPT to give me definitions of coincidences with examples, and also give me little known or other interesting ways of seeing coincidence also with examples. So first, the definition of coincidence is the occurrence of two or more events that happen at the same time or in a meaningful way without an apparent causal connection yet seem related. In simple terms, things line up in a way that feels meaningful, but we can't clearly prove that they caused each other, right? So there is no relation between these two things. And some people would argue that coincidences don't exist, that everything is part of fate, destiny, all these things, but we're going to get into the different ways that you can interpret a coincidence. Basic examples would include you're thinking about a friend you haven't spoken to in years and they text you that same day, right? That's a coincidence. It's like, oh, I was just thinking about you and you texted me, right? What a coincidence. You wear a random shirt to a cafe and the person next to you is also wearing the exact same one, right? So that's like a coincidence. It's two things that are related but that have no apparent relation, right? That have no profound relation, even though it seems meaningful, like it says in the definition. Two strangers discover that they were born in the same hospital on the same day, right? It's like, oh, what a coincidence. These events feel meaningful, but there's no obvious causal link, right? There's nothing that is causing them. So, interesting ways of seeing coincidence. We go deeper now. We have multiple frameworks for interpreting coincidences. One of them is statistical perspective or the probability perspective. From a probabilistic view, coincidences or patterns, also they can be known as patterns, are inevitable in large systems, right? Like in societies. Example, in a room of just 23 people, there's about a 50% chance two people share the same birthday. This is known as the birthday paradox, for example. So, what feels extraordinary or extraordinary may just be math, right? Statistics or probability. Two, pattern seeking brain. So this is more based on cognitive bias. Humans are wired to detect patterns even when none exist, right? So this is related to something known as apophenia, seeing patterns in randomness, or also known as patternicity, like believing in lucky numbers, right? Like if I choose seven, I always get lucky with seven, right? That's my pattern to a certain extent. So luck to a certain extent deals with patterns. That's also in order. That's a pretty interesting thing too. Or we can even say conditionals. Like if I do this, right? Like if before I go to a job interview, I wear my special cologne, I get hired, right? So that's the pattern. That's how I generate my luck. Confirmation bias too, which I think in this case, a lot of conspiracy theorists can be in this category of interpretation because you see certain things and you may be right, but you may be wrong. And by detecting certain patterns, you infer certain hidden things, right? Um, so confirmation bias. An example, you start noticing red cars everywhere after you buy a red car, right? So they were always there. Your brain just now starts to flag them. So coincidences become, or coincidence becomes amplified attention. Basically, you're just paying more attention to things that you weren't paying attention to before. Excuse me. The third framework is Carl Jung's synchronicity. So, psychologist Carl Jung, or his theory of synchronicity, like always checking the clock and seeing and seeing your clock at 11:11, or for example, what happens with me is I always see it at 1, 2, 3, 4. So like at 12:34, and I'm always like, why am I always seeing the clock at 1, 2, 3, 4? Right? That's kind of interesting. Meaningful coincidences that are not casually connected but are psychologically significant, right? Like you dream about a rare insect and the next day someone shows you that exact same insect. Or Carl Jung wouldn't say in this case it's causal, um, but he say it's meaningful, right? The fourth one is pretty interesting, the narrative construction theory. We build stories out of randomness, right? To kind of make sense of the world. So an example is you meet someone by accident, later marry them, and then you say it was fate, it was destiny, right? Like that's how it was supposed to happen. Like it was written in stone. But at that time, it was just wrong train, random seat, chance conversation. So coincidence becomes destiny through storytelling, right? Through organization. And see, we start to see a pattern unfold here with coincidence. Like there's a certain pattern that we give to these things in order to make them not a coincidence and start to interpret them as fate, as destiny, as, God's will, things like that. Fifth is existential interpretation. So coincidences sometimes confront us with randomness, contingency, fragility of plans, or just straight out chaos and disorder and mess. Missing a flight by 5 minutes that later crashes, right? So is that luck, fate, probability? This forces reflection and control, right? So it forces us. That's an interesting take because it forces us to basically come up with an answer as to why these things happen or why they happen the way they happen, right? Sixth framework is systems and network theory. In highly interconnected systems, surprising overlaps are more likely, right? So an example is two colleagues independently propose the same idea. And you can say, oh, that's a coincidence, but not magic. Both were exposed to the same environment and influences, right? So coincidences emerge, or coincidence emerges from shared networks, which this touches a little bit on the first framework, which is the probabilistic, like the probability that two people will come up with the same idea who are in the same context is likely, right? So it shouldn't be taken as a coincidence. Like that's that's what we're not seeing. And we have also emotional amplification. The more emotionally charged an event is, the more powerful the coincidence feels. An example, running into someone you love feels like fate, but running into a stranger twice in a week feels like randomness, right? So emotion intensifies perceived meaning, kind of like how a story will also amplify that perceived meaning. Less known view is coincidence as compression. Some philosophers argue coincidence is what happens when multiple causal chains intersect. We lack the visibility into the underlying variables, which in this case, it's that idea of it's not coincidence. You just can't see what's going on because there are too many factors, too many variables, too many things going on that you can't perceive everything. So you'll just brush it off as coincidence, right? Example, you and someone else choose the same obscure book at a store. Unknown variables are trending author interviews, shared social media algorithms, cultural timing. So it looks mysterious because the hidden structure is invisible, basically. A final perspective to this would be coincidence sits at the intersection of probability, perception, meaning, narrative, and emotion. It's not just randomness, it's randomness filtered through human interpretation, right? So we're also going to get into explaining irony and the defense mechanism in psychoanalysis, known as reaction formation, which is a little bit of what I explained. So I asked ChatGPT also to show me the relationship between both of these concepts and the relation of irony, the relationship between irony to the relationship of coincidence to irony and reaction formation. So we're going to understand first what is each one, and we'll go through examples to understand everything. So we're going to break it down like this. First, we have irony, which is a rhetorical concept. And these things kind of overlap in certain areas, but they're also very different in other areas. So irony is when there is a gap between what is said, what is meant, what is expected, and what actually happens, right? So we have the dual nature in irony as well as in the other ones. So in classical rhetoric, From traditions influenced by Aristotle, irony involves saying something while meaning the opposite, right? So intention is key there. And actually, the intention is not hidden. It's like a comedian that cracks a joke or makes a joke about something serious. People have to know that his intention is to be funny, right? But more broadly, it is about incongruity between appearance and reality, right? So there's that like imbalance, like this is not matching, right? Types, we have verbal irony, so saying great job when someone clearly failed, right? Situation irony or situational irony, which would be like a fire station burning down, since a fire station is in charge of putting out fires, right? Dramatic irony, the audience knows something the character doesn't, right? Like in a play or in a movie. Core structure of irony are two levels of meaning coexist and they conflict. They are in conflict, right? So again, irony is more narrative, we could say. It's a little bit more theatrical, it's a little bit more comical. Reaction formation is from psychoanalysis, and this originates with Sigmund Freud. So reaction formation is a defense mechanism where a person unconsciously transforms an unacceptable impulse into its opposite, right? An example, hostility becomes exaggerated kindness, right? Attraction becomes moral condemnation, which this is kind of interesting because I thought about like those movies where there's like an old person, right? And maybe they see someone, like I just recently saw it somewhere, but they see like someone young and attractive, and maybe they want to get with that person because they are attracted to that person. But then they'll say something like, "Oh, you're so foul," or "You're so blasphemous," or and they'll criticize the person they are attracted to because they can't, or they think they can't be attracted to that person, right? um, Envy becomes loud admiration, right? So over exaggerate. See, the key thing in reaction formation is over exaggerating your emotions, right? So if you are admiring someone, you can clap and say good job. But if you're like clapping really hard and saying a bunch of good stuff to that person, then we can say there's some type of reaction formation there, right? The structure is that there's a hidden impulse, right? There's anxiety, and then there's an exaggerated opposite behavior. It's not conscious lying, it's psychological inversion, right? Now, the structure or the structural similarity between irony and reaction formation is that irony is surface meaning, it's not true meaning, where reaction formation is surface behavior and it's not true impulse. In both of them, two levels coexist. So this is the part where they overlap. In irony, there's a tension between the explicit and the implicit. So what I say and what I mean, right? And in reaction formation, there's tension between the conscious and the unconscious. So sometimes the person is not even aware that they're doing this, right? The tension between explicit and implicit, and there's a tension between the conscious and the unconscious. Both of these involve inversion, dual layers, contradiction, and hidden structure beneath appearance, right? Irony is rhetorical inversion, emotional or psychological distance ultimately, and reaction formation is psychological inversion, right? So we can say that irony has that more like, like I was mentioning, like narrative, or yeah, that narrative structure or that storytelling structure. Where coincidence enters, and this is where it gets interesting, coincidence often feels like meaningful, or it often feels meaningful because two unrelated layers align unexpectedly, right? So this would be actually the opposite of irony and reaction formation, which are, see, coincidence aligns and irony and reaction formation separate, right? So two unrelated layers align unexpectedly. For example, you dislike someone, but you are overly kind to them, then they accuse you of being fake, right? That exposure can feel ironic. So this is like relating everything, right? Or someone who loudly condemns dishonesty is later caught lying, right? We experience that as ironic, hypocritical, meaningful, and almost poetic, right? Like I was thinking you could write a story about a character like this, right? Or maybe there have been. I'm just not that in tune to it. But psychologically, it may reflect reaction formation collapsing. Irony as psychological exposure, irony often reveals hidden structure, right? Reaction formation hides hidden structure. See, if you can be ironic, but if you're not caught, it's reaction formation because you're still hiding your intention. If you reveal your intention, it becomes ironic, and that's when it becomes like poetic or comical, right? So when reaction formation fails, life can look ironic. An example, a moral crusader against corruption is exposed as corrupt, like I was mentioning at the beginning. We call it ironic. Psychoanalysis might call it defensive inversion, breaking down, and coincidence as pattern detection. Coincidence, irony, and reaction formation all involve two planes of reality intersecting. So this is dichotomous. There's the surface and there's the hidden, right? There's the expected and there's the actual, right? Coincidence then feels meaningful because the world appears to respond to hidden layers, right? Irony feels meaningful because reality contradicts surface intention, right? And reaction formation feels meaningful when exposed because the unconscious leaks through, right? But when exposed, like I mentioned, because if it stays hidden, see, sometimes you can detect this in other people, but the person may not detect it in themselves, or you could be wrong even though you perceive it. And then there's another thing that you're doing there that's called projection. Maybe what you are carrying is what you're seeing in another person, but that's another topic I'm going to get into in the next video. Okay, the deep structural connection here is that all three involve discrepancy between appearance and the underlying structure, right? In irony, it's semantic discrepancy. In reaction formation, it's intrapsychic discrepancy. And in coincidence, it's event based discrepancy that feels meaningful. So they're they have like certain characteristics, all three of them, but they're different, right? That's the very interesting thing about them. One example connecting all three. Imagine a man constantly mocks overly emotional people. That's me. Secretly, he is deeply insecure about his own sensitivity. This would be like reaction formation. So that's why he externalizes that on others, as in, don't be emotional, right? Be logical. One day he breaks down publicly during a speech about emotional weakness. The audience experiences that as ironic, poetic, almost like fate, coincidental timing, right? But psychologically, it is internal contradiction surfacing, right? So it's revealing that which was hidden. It's awesome. Final synthesis: irony reveals contradiction, reaction formation hides contradiction, and coincidence makes contradiction feel meaningful, right? So all three depend on layered reality, inversion, and tension between what is visible and what is invisible.